Welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast, where we dive into real conversations that help leaders grow, teams flourish, and organisations thrive. I'm your host, Claire Gray, Leadership and Team Facilitator at Thriving Culture. I'm also the author of Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. This podcast is filled with practical tools, tips, actions, and insights that you can immediately apply so you can lead confidently now. In Season 2 of the Thriving Leaders podcast, I'm interviewing thought leaders from around the world to pick their brains on what it takes to build a thriving team. This is helping me write my second book, Thriving Teams, which will be out later in the year in 2025. I hope you enjoy the podcast. I've just had the most amazing conversation with Amy Edmondson. I'm feeling super energized and excited. So in this Thriving Leaders podcast, the focus is on thriving teams. And Amy shares her experience at the World Economic Forum. She also talks about psychological safety and some really practical tips on how to build psychological safety within teams. We talk about accountability and our shared passion that accountability needs to shift to a privilege. And we talk about learning and how to get teams into the learning zone so they learn from their mistakes, and also reflecting on why it's hard to fail and take risks. We also discuss hybrid work and the impact of hybrid work on teams. I personally got so much from this discussion, and I hope you enjoy this episode. So today it's an absolute honour to be speaking to Amy Edmondson. Amy's a Harvard professor and author of 7 amazing books. She's also ranked number 1 for the last 2 years with Thinkers 50's global list for top management thinkers. I personally have been following Amy's work for a really long time, especially around teaming, psychological safety, failure, and learning organisations. So thank you, Amy, for taking the time today to talk about thriving teams.
Glad to be here. Terrific.
Thank you. So when we were floating dates to do this podcast, I suggested a date, and you were actually at Davos in Switzerland on a panel at the World Economic Forum. So what was that experience like for you?
Well, it was great. It was a new experience, and it's a gathering of people from every possible field, although I think with an emphasis on business. And I'd say most of the conferences I go to are more academics and thinkers in a particular field of business, as opposed to business writ large and geopolitical forces writ large. So I often felt that I was in way over my head, and I was often struck by the certainty with which people pronounce what will happen next. I found myself, certainly this year, feeling quite uncertain about what to expect in the future. I think the future has never been more uncertain, but
Yeah.
it was expansive to be in a place where the goal was to think aloud and share ideas.
Yeah. What an amazing experience. It goes to show the impact that your work's had on the world as well. And I agree with you. I think we're living in a very ambiguous and uncertain time. And I think that also makes it challenging for leaders leading teams and individuals being in teams as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. So let's get into talking about teams, because I've got lots of questions to ask you. So there's often a common misconception that trust and psychological safety are the same thing. And trust is on a one-to-one relationship level, and psychological safety is this group norm. But what do you see as the key differences between vulnerability-based trust and psychological safety, and where do they overlap?
Well, they both have to do with vulnerability. So I'm glad you brought up that idea, right? So vulnerability is the state of being vulnerable, being aware that things could go wrong, right? You could be in harm's way. And I think that's all we should always be aware that we're vulnerable, but in a way that we emphasize and lean into our shared vulnerability. I think that's why teams are so powerful. Effective teams are those where we kind of realize, we're vulnerable. Like, we might not get this done, but we will be much less vulnerable if we're open with each other, if we're open and honest with each other. So indeed, both trust and psychological safety overlap and have to do with vulnerability. And as I think you said, trust is a construct that refers to your beliefs about another person or entity? Do you believe that person will follow through on what they said they would do, or have the capability or the intention to follow through on what they have promised? If you trust a company, for instance, if I trust, Toyota to deliver me a high quality car, that's a good use of the word trust. But I mean, trust really means that I don't have to go monitor you. I believe that it will work out with what you said or expect. Psychological safety, as you said, is an emergent property of a group. So it's going to have a lot to do with mutual trust in the group. But conceptually, what it means is a learning environment, a climate where people believe that they can take the interpersonal risks that learning necessarily requires, by which I mean asking for help, pointing out a mistake, sharing a crazy idea, experimenting. Those are all behaviors, learning behaviors, that do not have a certain or guaranteed result. And most of us human beings, we would prefer to have a guaranteed result. So psychological safety says, I feel okay about taking those risks, even though they don't have a guaranteed result, because I do believe I won't be harmed for taking them.
Yeah. So it's that environment that's created as a team. I spend a lot of time with leadership teams, and normally before I start working with teams, I catch up individually with each member of the team to find out what's really going on. And often when I interview each team member, there's often a misperception about whether there's psychological safety or not. Some team members feel like it's present, while other team members feel like they're unsure if people are holding back and questioning whether it's present. So how can individuals in the same team have such a different experience of psychological safety, but is this kind of shared group norm?
Well, there's a number of possibilities, right? I
Mm.
mean, it could be that different people have different familiarity with the team. They have different levels of status in the team. I mean, if I'm a new member of an executive team and I may just not yet know the norms around here, I am likely to be far more risk averse than someone who's been on the team forever and has seen how it operates. So it may be the first thing I'd look at is asymmetric information or asymmetric experience working with this team. Also, I mean, I'd want to be very clear on how you're getting those assessments. Like, are you asking people, do you have psychological safety? Or are you using a survey? Or are you kind of assessing behavioral tendencies in that team, right? So, because it could be, you don't want it to be just a theory of psychological safety.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I asked some questions based off your survey around psychological
Okay,
safety, and it's asking some questions, but not all the questions that are on the psychological
right.
safety survey. So it's probably not going
Yeah,
really deep because we're looking at lots of
yeah.
different things, but it's more about explaining to them what psychological safety is and what their sense of it
Okay.
is within the
And then
team.
seeing what they think.
Yeah.
Right. So again, different experiences, different status, and possibly like Jim Dietert and I did research where we found that your prior experiences in other teams or other companies can bleed into the present, right? So you might be on a team, like a great executive team that has never humiliated anyone, but you were humiliated in your last job. So you're tiptoeing in a way that other people aren't, and you're not even aware that you're tiptoeing in a way that other people aren't.
Yeah, so it's that ingrained from past experience. Can I pick up
Right.
on a point you made around tenure? So how does that influence someone's experience? So depending on how long they've been in the team, does that experience
Well,
impact
yeah.
psychological safety?
I mean, it's the combination of tenure and experience, right? Because if
Mm,
I've been on a team a long time and that experience has led me to have confidence that the responses to interpersonal risk taking are by and large positive, then that's a different answer than if I've been on a team a long time and I know it is a lion's den,
yeah,
right? It is a place where it's full of gotchas. People are just sitting around waiting to pounce when you say the wrong thing. Well, then my tenure
yeah.
isn't going to help much.
You've
So
learned to sit
it's
back
a
because
combination of
yeah,
tenure and experience, data.
definitely. So I feel like there's a lot of pressure put on leaders to be able to solve this psychological safety challenge. And it can be challenging within teams because everyone in the team influences whether there's psychological safety or not. But I do think the leader has a disproportionate influence on psychological safety within the team because they do
No
set the
question.
tone. Yeah. But it's very challenging for a leader to say, hey, how psychologically safe does everyone feel? Because if they don't feel safe, no one's going to say
Yeah.
anything, are they?
Yeah, no, and I wouldn't recommend that,
Yeah.
right? Honestly, I actually, I mean, maybe I'll overstate my case to make
Yeah.
a point, and then I'll dial it back.
Yeah.
So I don't think leaders should talk about psychological safety at all.
Yeah.
I think they should talk about the goal and the purpose and the mission and the, depending on what's accurate, the novelty of what we're trying to do, or the uncertainty, or the complexity, or the challenge. That's what the leader should be talking about. And then making the very accurate argument that, wow, this is going to require us to lean in to candor. This is going to require us to listen intently to each other and to take risks, right? So don't talk about psychological safety. Talk about this incredibly challenging, important work we're trying to do and what it will require of us. And that is psychological safety. So increasingly, here's where I dial it back a little. Psychological safety is not the goal for a management team. It's a means to the goal. So if you objectify it and put it front and center, they will just get annoyed because it's like, we got work to do. It's like, yeah, you have work to do. So let's do the work, and then let's figure out how some of the ways in which we are falling short in doing the work can be traced back to people not feeling able to fully employ their knowledge and their expertise. So if you want to have a focused discussion at all, it's like, let's talk about the quality of our conversations. Let's lean into, I think, the very real responsibility that especially leadership teams have to have high quality conversations. And those are conversations where people are not holding back the truth. They're not holding back their ideas. They're not holding back their reactions to each other's ideas. They're trying to say them skillfully and thoughtfully, not angrily or blamefully, but we're really doing our best to do that. There are also conversations where there's a healthy mix of idea sharing and experience sharing and question asking, where people are really asking high quality questions so that they can draw out each other's knowledge. And there are also conversations where people experience a sense of progress, like we're getting somewhere. I'm getting smarter, you're getting smarter, and we're getting closer to a resolution of this issue. Those kinds of conversations with those three attributes are rare. They're skillful. And I think that's, if you lean into building those kinds of conversations, you will be leaning into building psychological safety.
I love that you've said that because I like to think about having a really clear team purpose and about the why, and then also about what is it that we're going to deliver in terms of how we're going to hold each other accountable to that. And then the relationships is how we're going to get there, which has psychological safety and trust. So we can have those healthy, challenging debates. We can learn from our mistakes. We can learn from our successes as well, but we can actually have the conversation and we can disagree, but then get aligned to kind of the way forward as a team as well. So why is it so challenging for people to have those conversations? I think that McKinsey had a statistic around like only 26% of teams can actually operate with psychological safety and accountability and challenge and support each other. Why is it so challenging?
Yeah, well, I think that specific 26%, if we're talking about the same study, refers to teams that were this in survey data, they report both high challenge and high support, which definitely is a psychological safety phenomenon, right? That's a sad state of affairs, but probably true, right? Because it's a very powerful combination, right? And by challenge, it's what we were talking about before. It's like the work this team does is challenging and meaningful, and that's energizing.
Yeah.
And I'm not so worried about self-protection or how do I look that I'm distracted from the work. Like I'm actually engaged in the work. So, how do we, like, why are these conversations rare and how do we do more of them? I think they're rare because they're very skillful and most people have not been trained in these skills. Now that seems strange, but it's true. and haven't been explicitly trained in the skills of high quality conversation.
Mm.
And we have been trained, well trained, in the skills of impression management. I mean, think about it. Like our whole, sort of middle school, high school, university career lives are about learning how to come across the right way and to look good, not bad. And we're so well trained. I mean, by the time you're a mid-career adult, it's second nature. You're not doing it skillfully. I mean, you're doing it skillfully, but unaware. What do we call that? Sort of your unconscious competence. Right?
Yeah.
You've gone from young adult, maybe you're consciously competent, when to speak up, when to not speak up. And then by the time goes on, you're unconsciously competent. You just do it without thinking.
Yeah.
And that, I'm not saying it's bad or good, it's just unhelpful in an uncertain world. Right? So we need to unlearn the highly skilled behavior of looking good and trying to win, not lose, and relearn the skilled behavior of learning in teams with each other.
How do we build these high quality conversations in teams? Like, what are some things that leaders can do or individuals can do to try to not feel like they need to preserve looking good and actually have those high quality conversations?
I mean, I think it starts with setting the stage in along the lines we've already been talking about of, let's take a look. Let's set the stage by taking a look at what we're here to do, either today in this meeting or this year for our mission or whatever it is, right? Just it starts with being clear about the goal, the purpose, and then noting what that will require, right? To really achieve excellence in this, we will need to be, say, candid or creative or agile, whatever it is. And then pause to note. I mean, honestly, note that's not natural, not going to come easily. We're going to have to help each other, support each other, hold each other accountable for really leaning into learning habits with each other in these conversations. These are precious. This is precious time. Each other is a precious resource, and we must practice leveraging those precious resources effectively. And then real time, I recommend, and I increasingly recommend this, that if you describe the 3 attributes of a high quality conversation as people are, sharing what they know, listening intently, balancing questions and statements, not every other thing, but that there's a healthy mix of inquiry and that you have a sense of making progress. Those are 3 attributes that each and every one of us is fully equipped to self-assess. How are we doing? Meaning, how's the team doing? Right? So we're all kind of participants, but also judges or assessors,
real time. And so if I notice, for example, that we're going around in circles or that someone's getting into a heated debate but not really supporting, the two sides neither one is supporting their point of view very effectively, I have a responsibility to intervene, to say, hold on, I hear Kate saying this and Bob saying that, and honestly, I don't see how we, let's walk through it. Let's walk through the logic slowly so we can try to resolve where to go next, right? So everybody has both the potential and the invitation to intervene at any time to improve. So that you're constantly asking yourself, does it seem that people are, is Claire being quiet, right? If Claire is being quiet, at some point I might say, hey, Claire, what thoughts do you have? If Claire's doing all the talking, I might say at some point, hey, let's pause and hear from Kate, right? I have that. I'm empowered to do that. You're empowered to do that. And if we all take that seriously, we can do better. And we're all monitoring ourselves as best we can to have productive responses, learning-oriented responses. Like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. What might happen if? Maybe we can capture this on the whiteboard. Like, you're just recognizing the responsibility you have to use this time and these words wisely.
Yeah. So what I'm noticing is that it's about having the courage to be able to give feedback to each other and hold each other accountable to, the values that you've agreed together that you're wanting to demonstrate, but also being curious and having that sense of curiosity, being able to coach each other as a team. Yeah.
Yep. I think this sort of mix of curiosity and humility where you don't know the whole answer.
Yeah.
You might have a strong point of view, but you know that you don't have a crystal ball.
Mm.
And then the curiosity to say, well, I wonder what Claire knows. And then, so it really is, you're right. It's where you're coming from that will ultimately make the biggest difference. Not a set of skills that I can list and you can practice, but if you're coming from that place of curiosity, you will naturally ask questions.
Yeah, I love it. So, I mean, you've already given us some great ideas. Are there any other practical things that leaders can do to create that sense of psychological safety or that environment so that people can feel like they can be in that learning zone?
I mean, I think the most important thing leaders can do, I call it the 3 M's, but it's messaging, modeling, and mentoring. And the messaging is sort of what I said when we're setting the stage, like we're reminding people of what we're up against, that it's uncertain and challenging, and we're going to need, I sincerely convey that I believe we need all of us in the game to solve these challenges. Modeling is how you show up. I mean, I should probably start there because it's the most important thing. Your behavior as a leader has a larger influence on others than peers and subordinates' behavior. It's just a fact, right? So how you show up really matters. So be very self-aware and very thoughtful about the shadow that you can cast. And then thirdly, the mentoring is just as we were talking before, the ongoing opportunities to give feedback, to praise and tweak the behaviors that are happening. Because I think all managers at every level have a responsibility to develop those with whom they work.
Yeah, completely agree. So, and this might be a bit of a controversial question to ask, but we often focus on the leader's role in creating this environment of psychological safety in this learning zone. But what happens when the leader doesn't feel psychologically safe themselves? And what can they do in that situation? How can they navigate that?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what that means and why. I mean, if leaders find themselves thinking, gosh, I'd really like to say that, but I don't think I can. First of all, that's structurally unusual. I mean, psychological safety is permission for candor. It's not feeling comfortable, right? Because learning is uncomfortable. Leading is uncomfortable. Like every time I get in front of the classroom, I have psychological safety. I mean, I know that I am there. I'm in charge. My voice is welcome there. That's why I'm there. I will be heard. I will be listened to. And I think that's true for every leader in other settings too. That doesn't mean I'm feeling comfortable. I might be feeling very anxious. Like, I hope this class goes well. I've never taught it quite this way before. I might be planning all sorts of experiments or trying new things. And so I'm deeply, alert and full of adrenaline, and I'm going to be paying attention to what happens next. But let's not code that as a lack of psychological safety, because psychological safety essentially is that belief that your voice is welcome in the room. And if you have a leader who doesn't believe their voice is welcome in the room, that's very unusual. Like we'd have to dig into why that might be the case, because structurally their voice is expected in the room.
So if I give you an example, because I feel like I've had a couple of instances where the leader will share their view and feel like they get torn down, or those sorts of behaviors that happen, and it becomes a bit of an us and them, like the team versus the leader. And so then the leader starts withdrawing in terms of having that authority and influence within the team. And so it's not a common dynamic, I would say, but it does happen from time to time. Yeah.
I mean, I would characterize that slightly differently than not having psychological safety. They may now find themselves in a bind or in a situation that they don't quite know how to manage. And I think that situation you just described is not that uncommon. But given that they still have the role authority or the permission that their role gives them to speak, they actually can do something quite powerful and quite disarming, which is make this discussable. Like, for example, saying, I am having the following experience, or I've been observing that, and it's puzzling me. So I need your help. Right? Here's what I experienced, kind of what you just said. I experience, and I may be wrong. Please tell me if, I'd love to hear from you, but I'm saying such and such, and it's not having the impact that I hope, right? So I'm clearly I want to be effective, right? So I think we need to roll up our sleeves. I need your help to figure out what's not landing and what you're expecting or hoping for instead, because now then again, I may be truly missing something, right? So you make it discussable, you make it an object of learning, whereby, and again, because you have authority, you have permission that you are not taking advantage of, to kind of get their thoughts. Like, I need to know what you're, because in fact, it may be that what you're seeing and thinking is wrong, or it may be right, and you're putting them on the spot, but that's okay. You're allowed to put them on the spot. Written you off, like, let's start talking about it, because that's not going to work over the long haul, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think calling it out and bringing it so it's discussable, so that you can actually have a conversation about it, because also their experience might not be the intent and all those sorts of things too,
Right.
so that you can actually surface it. But it's also puts things into the learning zone, because it does feel uncomfortable, but it is going to probably shift the behaviors of people in the future, which is the intent.
Yes. And if this sounds sort of, what's the word, out of reach or, unrealistic for some leaders, then I would say you can still do it, but get help, get a facilitator or coach or someone to be present and to lead that conversation. But it's an essential conversation to have, because the status quo is not working.
Yeah. And shifting from that. So thinking about hybrid work, there's lots of return to work mandates. And what I think is quite interesting is thinking about psychological safety and being in this learning zone, and also failure, and how hybrid work's impacted that. What's your view?
That's a lot.
It's a big question.
Let me begin just with a basic statement, which is remote work and hybrid work on average have a negative effect on psychological safety, meaning psychological safety defined as people's sense of felt permission for speaking up, for sharing their thoughts, because it's just harder to do this. If you're right down the hall, it is so much easier for me to just stop by and say, I got this concern, it's probably nothing, or I had this crazy idea. But if it requires me to set up a Teams meeting with you, to discuss this, which we won't be able to schedule for a week and 2 weeks, whatever, and it's going to be a 30-minute block or a 60-minute block. I mean, it just puts a damper on regular voice, no question about it. So that observation means that we must find ways to overcome, override, enable, facilitate the full and healthy exchange of ideas and observations that would happen more naturally in person. It's not even easy in person, but it's easier, right? So that means you have to lean into and be very thoughtful and designed about what structures, what systems. Now, if you're hybrid, that presumably means some portion of the time you're face-to-face, some portion you're remote. Be thoughtful about which portion, right? Don't make the mistake of, let's go in 2 days a week or 3 days a week, and not say which ones, and not do it for, let's be clear about which tasks work just fine all by myself alone, and which tasks don't work that way. And then let's design accordingly.
I think it's like that connection with purpose is so important. Like actually being clear of how we're going to connect, and what's the intent of this meeting? It's for brainstorming, it's for decision making, it's for getting all the thoughts on the table, so that you can actually do it in a way that's thoughtful and purposeful. But I hear your point of the 5-minute informal chat gets lost a little bit.
Absolutely. And you have to so it's like you have to impose more structure, and that sounds like work. And guess what? It is. So what we're doing is we're now realizing, let's say commuting is a task, it's work, and we don't like it. And that's fine, but we don't get it there's nothing that comes for free, I guess is what I'm saying. So we now have to work harder at the things that used to come for free, right? In the face-to-face environment, certain things were more natural. So now we have to structure them, be more heavy-handed, be more like figure out which systems and how. Those are new tasks. The new tasks of making hybrid work are substitutes for the old task of commuting. And I'm willing to be agnostic for which set of tasks you choose. But I'm not willing to let people off the hook and say, oh, well, I'll just have no commute and everything will be fine. Like, no, right? You've got to choose the tasks that matter most for the team and then commit to those tasks.
It's that intentionality, isn't it? With being purposeful.
Yep.
So, and this might be, I know in Australia, the word accountability often gets used as a bit of a dirty word in the workplace. It's often
Here too.
blame. Yeah.
Yep.
Blame.
I want to redefine accountability in a big way.
I 100%, because I look at accountability as a privilege. I think it's actually a positive. Yes. So if someone's giving you accountability, they trust you, they're giving you ownership, but it doesn't always land well, because I do a lot of work on accountability with teams. So what's your view on why accountability is so important with a thriving team?
Well, first of all, I think I'll say why it's such a dirty word. I mean, it's because people have learned to equate it with blame, which is a real shame, right? Because accountability is a privilege. Accountability is your power to own your contribution to outcomes, good and bad. This is why it's important. First, I'll give the definition, then why it's important. I define, or I think of, I don't think it's defined, but I think of accountability as psychological ownership, right? It's my ability, my willingness to own my contribution to results. And that means I'm like willing to commit to doing what I promised to do and all that. But it also means when things go wrong, I'm eager and willing to take a look at where I contributed, both in areas of omission and commission. And that's a very powerful thing to do. And it's a privilege to have if you have no accountability, you're basically in a job where someone has just told you, you have to do it just like this. You can't deviate. You can't use your creativity. You just execute exactly as we follow the script, right? You have no accountability either way. If it doesn't go right, it's not your fault. You didn't write the script, right? So that's a kind of non-privilege, right? And the more leeway you have in your professional life, the more privilege you have and the more accountability you have.
Yeah.
It's so interesting whether you own it.
Right? Yeah. Hearing you talk about accountability and that psychological ownership, and then the link to owning up when you've made mistakes, which kind of links to psychological safety, but also learning from those mistakes, which is the learning. So like they're so intrinsically linked: accountability, psychological safety, learning. Like there's just such a strong link between them all.
Yeah. No question, right? It's all so accountability, defined and described as you and I just have, is it's obviously important, right? Because that's what that kind of psychological ownership is what you need and want every employee to have, because then they've agreed, in a sense, it's like a psychological contract. They've agreed to do their part toward the joint mission.
Yeah. It's interesting. The way I like to think about accountability as well is there's individual accountability, which probably links to that psychological ownership you're talking about. Then there's the mutual accountability that happens between people and within teams. And then there's this collective accountability, which is more systemic, which happens between teams and stakeholders, and the interconnectedness of work as well. And I think from a cultural perspective, you need all three things to actually really have a culture of accountability. And often I think that there's a disconnect.
Yes.
Yeah.
I completely agree. And what you just described is, on the one hand, sort of, an idealized setting, but why shouldn't people strive to achieve that idealized setting, right? That's what we're ambitious. We only are here for the time on earth we're here. Like, wouldn't you want to sign up to do that? Whereas instead we inadvertently often feel like we want to sign up for ease, and that's kind of sad in a way.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think that, like with individual accountability, some people feel like they're going to be micromanaged or they're going to get blamed. And then I think with mutual accountability, that's maybe when egos might come in, because we kind of have a disconnect between our team members. And from a collective perspective, it's often when we see lots of siloed behavior as well.
Yes,
and so it's like challenges that teams and organizations experience. But I think that, I know it does sound like the ideal, but I think navigating through the individual, mutual, and collective is really important for actually getting a culture of accountability. Yeah.
Yep. I think when teams begin to explore that together, they can recognize both that that's challenging and hard, but also that it's important and necessary.
Yeah.
And as long as I, care enough about what we're doing and each other, we'll find a way to do
Yeah.
it.
So just to pick up on a point you spoke about when you were talking about accountability and the psychological ownership, and you talked about, sharing when you've made mistakes. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about failure and risk taking, and because we need to, especially as teams, we need to learn from our mistakes. Individuals learn from their mistakes, but teams
Mhm.
also learn from their
Mhm.
mistakes and their successes as well. And obviously you've written a fabulous book, The Right Kind of Wrong, which talks about risk taking and failure. So, what can we learn about failure and risk taking in the context of teams?
Well, I wrote a whole book about it. So
Yeah.
let me say a couple of things, because actually I think we're very lucky in those of us who have English as our primary language, because I'm learning this as the book is being translated. It's been being translated into 29 languages. And it turns out that many languages don't have a different word for mistake and failure.
Oh,
But they
interesting.
are very different concepts, and I
Yeah.
write about them differently. So, mistake is an unintended deviation from a known practice or knowledge or process or protocol.
Mm.
And at our very best, we'll all make mistakes, right? But we can work hard and succeed at minimizing the important ones. When the stakes are high, you follow that recipe, you drive carefully, you don't text. I'm in favor of helping us minimize the sort of stupid mistakes, right? The things that don't create new value as a result of making them. Failure is an unintended an undesired, also unintended, but an undesired outcome. Some failures are in fact bad, right? 2 weeks ago's plane crash at Washington National Airport was a devastating, complex failure. We don't want to see that again. We would never celebrate it. It's utterly preventable. It's a
Mm.
handful of factors. Eventually, we'll know more when they finish the analysis. Other failures, you run an experiment in a lab, you really hope you're right. This could be a game-changing research finding, but alas, you're wrong. Those truly must be celebrated. So I talk about basic failures, which are those that are caused by mistakes and are theoretically and often practically preventable. Complex failures that are a handful of factors coming together in just the wrong way that again produce undesired results, smaller and larger. And then there are intelligent failures. Those are the ones that teams must. So I think teams must do both the best job they can to prevent failures in familiar territory where we have a recipe, let's use it, and to create environments of risk-taking where we can engage in smart experiments, which sometimes will end in successes and sometimes will end in intelligent failures, and welcome that new information, learn from it, value it, and push ourselves to have more, not less, of intelligent failure.
Mm. It's so ingrained in us, like going back to your point before about looking good. Like on Sunday, I've got my 10-year-old son has just started a new school and he wanted to go for student representative council and he's like SRC for his grade 5 class. And he said, "Oh, Mum, you know what? There's no point in going for it. I'm new. People can only vote once. There's more girls in the class. There's more girls going. And the other boy, like everyone knows him." And so, and it made me just think about like, holding ourselves back because we don't want to look bad and, all
Right,
these sorts of
right.
things. And so it gets ingrained from like a really early age. And so the conversation I had with Jackson was, well, why do you want to do this? Like, what's the purpose of
Yeah.
doing it? And he said, oh, I want to be sports captain next year. And they said, if you've been in a leadership position, you're more likely to get another role. And so I said, well, what's the harm in going for it anyway, just to practice and, put yourself out there.
Yeah.
So he ended up doing it. He wasn't
Right.
successful, but, he put
Yeah,
himself
no,
out
but
there, which is great.
that was success,
Yeah,
right?
that was success.
Going for it
Oh,
is success.
exactly. Like he's having a
Yeah.
crack. And I think that's really, really
Yeah.
important.
I
So,
think so too.
like, how do we help adults unlearn at this protection that we have so we do take more risks, because I guess it can be really hard to take challenging risks because sometimes you feel like your job's on the line as well.
Yeah.
And so,
Well,
like, how do you get the balance right being
well,
to create those conditions?
yeah, well, I've been in organizations and I think we should have more of them, which, depend organizations where a part of the organization truly depends on innovation, right?
Yeah.
That's their job. And the best ones who truly depend on innovation are the ones who will be where the leaders are explicit about If you're not failing, you're not doing your job
Yeah.
here, right? Because this is the innovation department, and the innovation department requires lots of experiments and risks. And if you're only doing safe ones, if they all work out, you're not doing your job. Like, we already know how to do the stuff we already know how to do. We're looking to you to help us find out how to do the stuff we don't yet know how to do. So that's a framing, that's a stage setting move. So that's part of the answer, is sort of making sure people are on the same page about what sport we're playing and why that sport requires risk taking, and even better still, how you're falling short when you're only succeeding, right? That's like a bad report card.
Yeah.
I think that's true in parenting. If you have a kid that's never been rejected from a team, or never not made it to the school play, or never ever gotten a poor mark, they're not taking enough risks. The whole point of childhood is to stretch and grow. And if every single thing a child and then a teenager sets out to do works out perfectly, that child is not learning as much as the child who's willing to go for things, even knowing there's a very real chance I won't be elected, or I won't be selected.
Yeah. Well, it's the whole fixed mindset, growth mindset. And often
Yeah, exactly.
we've always succeeded, but we get it ingrained fixed mindset and then we get really shocked when we do fail, and that really hurts. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's what adults need to do too. I mean, the fixed mindset work, Carol Dweck's wonderful work, was done initially for kids, but it's equally applicable to adults, right? I mean, if
100%.
we embrace that growth mindset, then it's like, it's a muscle. My brain, my abilities are muscles that I need to strengthen. And part of the way you strengthen them is through trying things that aren't sure you can do perfectly.
Yeah. And challenging ourselves and putting ourselves out there. So kind of linking back to what you were talking about earlier, like, I like to think about, the why and the how being purpose and relationships around psychological safety and trust. And I find the outcome of that is this sense of belonging. And then likewise, I like to think about the how being the strong relationships through psychological safety and trust and accountability, and the intersection of that being that healthy, challenging debate. But that outcome is learning. So what's the importance of belonging in teams? And then also, you probably already touched on the importance of learning, but what's the importance of belonging? Because I see it as an outcome.
Yeah. I mean, belonging, I don't know how you think of it. I think of belonging as the belief or the confidence that I'm part of this group, whatever that means, this team, this organization, right? I belong here. And hopefully doesn't mean homogeneity, that we're all the same, but that sense that someone like me, and me in particular, is a full-fledged member of this group. This group is happy to have me in its midst, and I'm happy to be in its midst. So that's the confidence that you belong, that you have a role to play here that is at least moderately valued by others.
Yeah.
That matters, of course, right? Because I think it's exhausting, and it requires a great deal more impression management. If you feel like an outsider, you feel like you don't belong, then you're either working doubly hard to try to belong, even though you don't belong, feel you don't belong. You do belong, but you feel you don't belong, let's say. Or you're kind of doing the quit and stay routine because you feel like you don't belong. You don't really lean in. You don't experience psychological ownership or psychological safety. I mean, I think psychological safety and belonging go hand in hand because they're both really a sense of, I have permission to contribute honestly around here.
Yeah. And I think you kind of feel when it's lacking too. What I find interesting with belonging and teamwork, I think these days we're often part of multiple teams. We're not just part of one team. We kind of identify with being in multiple teams as well. And I like to think of it, rather than having a first team or a primary team, more about having a one team mindset, and how you do need to shift to your context, but how you create a one team sense of belonging. More broadly, because I think that shifts the decisions we make and makes people lift the gaze, so they're not making decisions for their patch or working in silos too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I love that.
Yeah. So I'm going to probably embarrass myself, but so the last question I've got, I'm just going to plant it for you, and then I'm just going to share a little story with you. So if you could leave our listeners with one thought about thriving teams, what would it be? And while you're having a little think about that, I just wanted to share that a year ago, I reached out. What happened was I wrote a post on LinkedIn. I just read your book, The Right Kind of Wrong, and I'd seen you speak at the Growth Faculty. And I wrote a little post and I tagged you in it, not thinking you'd respond. And I said, because I was going to Harvard in June last year, and I said, oh, hopefully I bump into Amy there. And then you responded and said, let's make a point of it. And I was like, oh my gosh, Amy Edmondson responded to me. And then so I sent you a little email. And unfortunately for me, you were in Portugal at the time that I was there. But you responded and you said, oh, Amy Claire in brackets, spelt the same way, Edmondson, a little smiley face. And I remember calling my mum and I'm like, oh, Amy Edmondson responded to my email. And then when I reached out at the end of the year and asked you if I could interview you for my book, you said yes straight away. And it has been a real highlight because for me, a leadership and team development person, like your thought leadership has just been so influential to my work. So I just want to say a huge thank you to you. And I look forward to sharing my book with you once it's finished. So
I look forward to reading it. Yeah, I can't wait. Thanks. That is such a great story, and that brings it back. And it always surprises me, I have to say, when someone has that kind of reaction. It's like, I'm just me, you know.
Yeah. Well, and you're very authentic as well, which I absolutely love, because everyone's like, just be careful when you meet your heroes, you'll be disappointed.
Okay.
And so, Amy Claire Edmondson, if you could leave our listeners with a final thought about thriving teams, what would that be?
I really think thriving teams are learning teams. And so that means leaning into curiosity. That's probably the foundational attribute or skill. You could say almost everything flows from that.
Yeah, completely agree. Thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate your time today.
Yep, my pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this podcast. I got so much out of the conversation with Amy. Some of my key takeaways were around some practical tips to be able to build psychological safety within a team, especially for leaders. So I really like the 3 M's model, which was around messaging, modeling, and mentoring, and how they're really practical skills to help build a thriving team and build psychological safety. I also loved her tip around high quality conversations and learning skills to do that effectively. So sharing, listening, balancing questions and inquiry. And I like the fact that she talks about having a self-assessment to check in on individually how you're going, but as a team, how are we going with this? And I really enjoyed the conversation about accountability, and you can see both of our passion around reshaping what accountability looks like within organisations. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for joining us at the Thriving Leaders podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our leadership programs, including our Thriving Leaders program, Thriving Women in Leadership and Thriving Teams, as well as executive and team coaching, keynote speaking or facilitation, head to our website, www.thrivingculture.com.au. This is also where you can sign up for our newsletter, where I share useful leadership and team development insights and tools, as well as our podcast. You can also grab your copy of my book, Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. It's also available at all good online retailers on Audible, Spotify, and Kindle. If you like this episode, I'd be so grateful if you left a 5-star review, as it helps us reach more people and therefore helps more leaders thrive.